and welcome to Purposeful Empathy, a show dedicated to conversations with people who want to grow and spread empathy throughout the world.
Hi, today I'm joined by Fabrice Vil, who is the founder of Purposeful, a social enterprise in Montreal. He's also a former lawyer, and lately you've been doing some amazing activist and advocacy work within the conversation around Black Lives Matter, and you are also a journalist and an outspoken writer and media commentator. So thanks so much for being with me today, Fabrice.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.
This spring, you became an outspoken individual in the city to talk about what was happening as a result of the COVID pandemic, and then as a result of the massive demonstrations in the city after George Floyd's death. You know, as a white woman, I am very keen to unlearn a lot of sort of the society's stories and to actively engage in empathic behavior on purpose, to be supportive to the anti-racist work and to fight systemic racism. So I'm really keen to have this conversation with you because I think you're having a lot of dialogues publicly about what is happening in the world and what all of this means. So what are some things that you really want to share with anybody who's listening about how to show up as an empathic person in the fight for to dismantle white supremacy?
Okay. So I would say the weird thing that I would say, I mean, I'm starting by saying that it's a weird thing, but I think it's a weird thing. I think that in my life, I've had the privilege of connecting with friends, people who suffered the dynamics of systemic racism in a way that really personally resonated with me. So beyond the theories and you know all the movement that we currently see, where it's sometimes intellectualized, I grew up even being a black man myself, but I was a black baby and a black child. So I grew up experiencing and seeing problems and navigating the world in a way that some other people don't. And when I referred earlier to friends, some of my friends, I've been friends growing up with many people who not only are black people, but also lived and still live under social economic conditions that I didn't go through. So those who are sometimes even more exposed to criminalization, for example, you know, I've seen how compounded this can be and how much of an impact this could have on people who were my friends. So I mentioned, and I think to me, this is a privilege, not within the sense of power dynamics, but in my own life, I would say not a privilege, but a gift that this was given to me in my life, because it informs the radical curiosity that I have in my view around what systemic racism is, because it really resonates with my life. Now, I would say, moving to where we're at today, one thing that and doing the work of thinking about racism a lot and inequalities a lot, I came to thinking that one thing that prevents us from going fully and doing whatever we can to fight racism and promote a more just society is that we have the understanding that racism is a crime. And I do see that racism is not a crime, but is rather a crisis. And I want to acknowledge the fact that racism can be seen as a crime against humanity. I do acknowledge also the fact that racism, many crimes, hate crimes, many crimes are motivated by racism. But I think that if we want to go full on tackling all the subtleties, like all of them, we should see that racism is a crisis, just like climate change, for example. When we think of climate change, it's easier to to understand the human mind, I think is more capable of saying it's multifaceted. There's so much that has to do with climate change, and unfortunately, we're still not doing enough. But we're at least, I think, collectively acknowledging that it goes all the way from composting to the broad policies that not only countries but multiple countries could be put. We don't do that with racism, because sometimes thinking that it's a crime is about finding the person who should be accused and rooting out that person, which is not bad when the person commits a crime. But I think that to have the full-on conversation that we need, it's really to think that there's so many layers, and there's no right or wrong answer. It's just about taking this huge mammoth and saying, look, let's tackle this. Also understanding, and I guess this is maybe the difference between climate change and racism. There's a huge amount of shame and guilt for white people. So, climate change, and I go with my personal experience. I don't wake up feeling profoundly shameful around my behaviors with respect to the environment. Maybe someday I will. Maybe someday there'll be a movement that will get to a point where I'll be thoroughly feel shameful, and I might be, under the defensive, but we're not there. But the racism creates that feeling that is profoundly, there's a lot of shame. So I don't have yet the answer of how we can collectively go beyond that shame. Actually, there's a lot of pain that will come with it. And that's what I see sometimes in the divisions and the debates and the violence that come with it. I have someone that I know who refers to the movie The Exorcist. Mm-hmm. How when you take out the demon out of someone, how painful that is. He says that this is the current place we're in history, and it's painful and it's violent and it's messy and it's chaotic. So there's that. And I would end, and I will probably invite any comment or question on your part, but the last thing that I would mention is the fact that in that conversation, more and more, I want to be mindful of those that we just don't hear. Because as a person that has the privilege of being in the public sphere, having articles and being in media, I may be a Black person, but I'm also highly privileged as a person who grew up in a loving family, as a person who grew up with educated, both my parents are educated, that paid, that made sacrifice to pay for my education. I'm able-bodied. I'm heterosexual. And all of that have led to the position that I have. So in this talk, I'm not even the one that is mostly affected, even though I'm affected by racism, but how those who are in those places, that are some people like my friends that I grew up with, who some of them are in jail, some of them are dead, some of them don't have just basic opportunities that the society can generally provide. How can we be engaged, and how can I be engaged with these people? That's a really, really tough one. And I was just with a conversation with someone that I know who made me realize, it's like, well, it's great that you're in this media and that media, but these medias don't reach our people. So what do we do about that? How can we have a conversation around racism while the people who are affected the most don't even know what conversation is going on? Like, this is like totally mind-boggling for me, right? So I guess this is an extra example of how much of how we can't deal with racism as being a crime, because if we make it a crime, it's going to be taboo. And if it's taboo, we're not going to tackle it full on. If we see it as a crisis, like a pandemic, like how much we had the pandemic in our face, it's like we have to deal with it. So there's no taboo around the virus. there may be ignorance, there may be a lot, but it's still like the collective responsibility because we know it's in front of us and we need to tackle it.
The system of racism is not just about the color of skin. It is about power dynamics. It is about economics, and seeing it through that lens has opened up for me a lot, where I don't feel as defensive anymore. Personally, I don't feel as fragile. I know that there's a notion of white fragility, because I fundamentally care about issues of equity around healthcare and access to education and housing and fair taxation and progressive. So I feel like I can contribute to that work, and it doesn't feel like I need to feel so defensive about that any longer.
Right. And I can make the assumption that you've still been through that feeling and you've taken responsibility to actually explore what that meant, while some people, once they feel the guilt and shame, they don't engage with how they feel. So that's more the personal way. Knowing you, I can just make the hypothesis that you still processed it, right? So that's one thing. You were about to say something.
Yeah, just to respond, like I remember teaching a graduate level course in the early part of my career. I was still doing my PhD, and I had a astute Black woman in my class who called me out saying, how is it that the canon of your, the readings on your syllabus are all a bunch of white men? And I felt horrified. I felt shameful that I hadn't done justice to be more inclusive. And that has changed the way I look at my syllabi. I make sure that my guest speakers, that there's gender parity and that there's diversity across as many lenses as I can intentionally now.
Right. Exactly. So and that's a great example, right? Because some people could have been under the defensive and not move towards the impact and how you as a teacher and have an impact in the context, but they would be stuck with the shame and guilt and justification to say, look, this is how the world is. I mean, they're great authors, and why do we would and so to make that shift to say, I feel bad and it's part of the work, and how can I listen to what the person has said and how this can have an impact on all levels. That's an example of a great action, because all those students who will still learn from you, benefit, and the people that they engage with benefits. So that's how we just at multiple levels, macro and micro, fight notion of racism. And I think to that point, going back to history and understanding that colonization has been a massive operation. And just to be clear, in no way am I going to say that we're talking about monsters here. That's not my opinion. We're talking about power. It's a massive power operation of European countries that have been fighting for money, for territory, for resources, and they basically competed to dominate the territory that was the earth, that is still the earth. And that, when we're talking about kings and queens who were in connection with religion, that is so powerful, had a tremendous impact. And we're talking about Europe and then the Americas and Africa and all the slavery that went on, how that affected philosophy, entertainment, all the artists, culture, everything that was, and then this translates into how people think, and then that creates the movement, because the human brain can unconsciously process 11 million bytes of information per second unconsciously. It can only process 40 consciously. So when we talk about unconscious biases, It's really how we're affected by our environment. But if everywhere in our environment, we have messages that unconsciously create those biases, and we all have them, everybody, including myself, so I'm not in a different society, then it creates different behaviors, then it shapes the stories that we tell about ourselves, and we as humans become the people who create the system. So the systemic racism, the first system that creates it is the human as a system. And then it's like a vicious circle.
Yeah, and what I'm hearing is sort of there's two levels to this. There's the political level of like the politics of challenging the status quo and recognizing that sort of like the cognitive work of recognizing that colonialism and capitalism have worked as systems to keep this structure in place where some people benefit at the expense of others, and that there's a need to dismantle that if we do believe in equality for people and that everyone should have access to all the things I mentioned earlier. But there's also at the same time for me a very spiritual dimension to this work, because if we recognize that we share a common humanity and that we are interdependent and that we are all born and all die, like that shared humanity, then I think that there is a need to sort of also decolonize not just our minds, decolonize our hearts, right? And to
Totally.
There's some really big, deep work that has to happen that also needs, there's the transformational external work and then there's the internalized work.
Yes, totally. It is a somatic, like physical, emotional, cognitive, and it's social, but you stated it's spiritual as well. I think that we are currently at a period where that notion of consciousness is more and more talked about. And to me, that is spiritual. So doing that depth of work, I think is crucial. I believe in that because that, through the Purposeful work that I do, when we talk about training coaches, it has to do with supporting the personal growth of the individual and to lead to an impact. And and while I'm advocating for this, I also would say that it's going to be fascinating how we navigate this, because in many authors who talk about leadership development, consciousness, spirituality, there is also that bias that there are people who are more conscious than others, who have developed some abilities that others don't have. I still don't have the answer of how to navigate this, because I think that even in acknowledging that this fight for a more just society includes spirituality, I'm curious about how we can do this without creating, again, a hierarchy who are more valuable than not. Because there are people who are gurus who are like, I'm more woke, I know more, and then they just reproduce the same thing that they say that they're fighting. So all these scandals that we see, there's documentaries on Netflix and whatnot around people who have been abusing groups, because they have tremendous power on people's minds and emotions. That can be manipulated in a way that creates scandals, but in a very, very subtle way. We can be trapped in a context where we believe that there are leaders who know more. And I would say that I'm fighting that in my own personal life, because I've thought so much about various things. I don't want to be seen as like any savior. I don't want to be seen as the hero. So how can I acknowledge the fact that I have access to some information, take my space in the world, while not pretending that I'm better? That's a really tough. And I think all of us have that responsibility to say, well, what's my place in this world? Which is spirituality in and of itself? Just that question,
Yeah, which is why I love the frame that you used earlier about being radically curious, right? And, you're radically curious, and I like to believe that I engage with empathy on purpose, so purposefully empathic. So right. I think, That's why I think that's why we like each other so much.
Yes.
And I think on this note, I'll just say thank you so much, Fabrice. This was a really, really soulful, deep conversation. Thank you to all the listeners who are joining us for this episode, and have a great day.
Thank you. And thanks to the people who listen to us. Thank you.